It was the sort of evening Oxford does best, a thin fog blurring the edges of things, so that the lamplight on the high hung in the air like some patient amber moth, refusing to land. I had left the crossword half finished on my desk, the clue, eclipsed truth, gnawing quietly at me as I buttoned my coat. There's a point at which a clue stops being a game and begins to feel like an accusation, though I could not have said why this one troubled me so. The Isis lay quiet beneath the mist, its surface taking and giving back the reflections of the gas lamps along the path. The muffled bells from Christchurch marked the hour, with the weary grace of a choir, too long in practice. My breath drifted upward into the dark and disappeared. I envied it the ease of vanishing. I passed a couple walking slowly, their conversation an indistinct murmur, the sort of sound the fog swallows before you can place it. Above them, the outline of Tom Tower floated, half-formed. I kept my pace deliberate, as if each step needed permission. The Bodleian rose out of the gloom like an old ship at anchor. Somewhere within, a single light burned against the thickening night. A reading-room window on the second floor, pale gold against the stone. I might have walked past without noticing, had it not been for the stillness of the figure inside. A woman, leaning forward over a desk, her head inclined in that particular way which, at a distance, could be mistaken for study or sleep. I hesitated only briefly. A late scholar, I told myself. This city has always been home to such strange devotions. Yet I walked more slowly as I moved on, my gaze catching on small things. The way her hair in the lamplight took on a copper edge, the neat stack of books beside her, the odd sensation that nothing around her was moving. But the fog pulled me forward, as it always does, persuading me to leave questions unanswered until they become part of the pavement underfoot. Later, back in my flat, the radio was murmuring to itself. I poured a measure of whiskey and watched the condensation bead along the window. The news was local, the voice careful and unhurried. A fellow of Sciento Athanasius College, Dr. Margaret Ellison, had been found dead in a Bodleian reading room by the night porter shortly before closing. No further details. I felt the glass pause just short of my lips. Margaret Ellison. The name rang faintly, though no clear memory followed. Like a half-recalled bar from a piece of music you heard once in childhood. I tried to summon the circumstances, a seminar perhaps, or a formal dinner, but nothing materialized except the persistent echo of the name. I returned to the crossword, though the letters blurred somewhat in the low light. Eclipsed truth. My pencil hovered, then scratched out two possibilities before retreating into indecision. The whiskey offered no better clarity. I thought again of the copper edge of her hair, the stillness around her, the way the night had pressed itself to the Bodleian walls. There is, I suppose, a kind of courtesy in leaving the dead to their silence. And yet I found myself uneasy, not at the fact of her death, but at the quiet inevitability with which I had walked away from her window. I switched off the radio, the room folding in on itself, and sat there with the clue still unresolved, feeling, though I could not have told you why, that I had already stepped into something from which there would be no easy retreat. St. Athanasius has always been one of those Oxford colleges that seems determined to keep the century outside at bay. High walls, narrow gates, an air of permanent Lent. You can walk past it every day and never quite notice it, as if the stone has learned the trick of discouraging the eye. Lewis and I stood just inside the small archway that serves as its main entrance, the fog from the night before replaced by a brittle cold, the quadrangle pale with frost. Lewis briefed me in his steady, unhurried way, the one he uses when the facts are too thin to be reassuring. Margaret Ellison had been a fellow here for 15 years, specialist in medieval poetry, particularly a fragmentary 15th-century manuscript with a title that sounded more like a confession than literature. She had been preparing a new critical edition, the sort of work that requires patience, monastic quiet, and a willingness to disappear for weeks at a time. There was no sign of forced entry at the Bodleian, so cause of death uncertain. The coroner was cautious, which usually means unwilling to guess. We were shown to the master's lodgings, a book-lined room that smelled faintly of pipe smoke and last winter. Sir Julian Crewe was a tall, austere man whose politeness came in carefully measured doses. He spoke of Doctor Ellison with the sort of respect one reserves for an intractable but brilliant colleague. There had been, he admitted after a pause, some recent disagreements among the fellowship. Academic matters, naturally. Interpretation of the manuscript, questions of attribution. Nothing, he assured us, that would account for anything untoward. There is a particular tone in such assurances, the one that insists on drawing a curtain rather than opening a window. I let him talk. His hands were perfectly still on the desk, except when he reached to turn the pages of a small leather diary, though he never once looked at it. The porter's lodge was warmer, the smell of tea thick in the air. A small electric fire hummed on the counter. The porter, a man whose face seemed permanently set to mild suspicion, recounted the evening routine in sparse, well-worn phrases. I let Lewis do the questions. My eyes wandered over the cramped interior, the rack of pigeonholes, the keys hung in neat brass-labeled rows, the desk with its open ledger. It was habit more than intention that made me leaf idly through the visitor register. The names were neatly entered, the handwriting betraying a certain pride in legibility. About halfway down the page, my eye caught an oddity. A name underlined, but not in ink. A pale pencil mark, faint as dust. H. Fenton. The date beside it was 3 days before Ellison's death. There was no annotation, no reason for the emphasis. Yet the line seemed deliberate, the sort of gesture made when one wants to draw attention without quite admitting to it. I asked the porter about it. He frowned, leaned forward, and said he hadn't noticed any pencil marks before. Could be just someone doodling. He didn't recall the name. Many visitors, you understand. I nodded, but the explanation felt like a coat that didn't quite fit. Serviceable, but uncomfortable once worn. Back in the quad, the frost was already softening, drops falling from the cloister arches. Lewis asked if the name meant anything to me. Not yet, I said. But it will. These things have a way of returning, like a phrase you can't place until you're halfway across town. As we left, I glanced back at the gatehouse. Behind one of the high windows, the curtains moved slightly, as if someone had been standing there a moment before. Whether watching us go or merely closing out the cold, I couldn't tell. Oxford has a gift for keeping its secrets dressed in ordinary gestures. And St. Athanasius, I felt, had no intention of giving this one up easily. There is a certain choreography to academic interviews. Everyone knows the steps, but no one quite admits to dancing. You ask a question, they glide sideways. You nod thoughtfully, they retreat into a footnote. Sir Julian received us in the same high-ceilinged study as before, his hands folded as if in benediction. His voice had the faint music of someone accustomed to being obeyed without ever issuing commands. Ellison, he said, had been brilliant, committed, perhaps a little too fond of unearthing things better left buried. He let the phrase hang in the air like incense in a chapel. I asked what those things might have been. He offered a dry smile. Old quarrels, fragile reputations. In a place like this, the past is always closer than you think. His gaze drifted towards the window, where the pale winter light lay across the quad like a faded photograph. I left him to it. Clara Mowbray's rooms were the opposite, cramped, overheated, with a faint smell of coffee gone stale. She was young enough to speak quickly, old enough to regret it. We were friends, she said, more than friends. Allies, at least. In a college that didn't welcome strong opinions. She insisted they had no quarrel, that Ellison had been like a mentor to her, but she never once met my eyes, preferring to look past my shoulder at the wall of books. I noticed a volume half pulled from its place, a medieval poetry anthology whose spine was worn to softness. She spoke of Ellison's kindness, her meticulousness, her occasional stubbornness, but the words felt rehearsed. As we left, Lewis murmured that perhaps grief took different shapes. I said nothing. Professor Hugh Fenton greeted us in the senior common room, where the fire burned low and the leather chairs smelled of 100 quiet conversations. He was courteous, affable in the way of men who enjoy the impression of openness. He claimed to have known Ellison only in passing, a nod in the library, a word at high table. A shame, really. She seemed a serious scholar. His eyes rested lightly on mine, almost inviting agreement. I thought of the visitor register in the porter's lodge, the pale pencil underlined beneath his name. I said I'd heard he had visited 3 days before her death. Yes, he said. He had come to consult a rare book. His tone was even, but the pause before the answer was a fraction too long. Lewis asked which book. Something on Provençal verse, he replied, glancing towards the window as though the details might be drifting past outside. Peter Dalrymple was waiting for us in the library, a tall, nervous man whose voice betrayed the effort of keeping it steady. He spoke warmly of Ellison, her generosity with her time, her patience with his halting thesis. She had been worried lately, though. Something in the archives, he said. He didn't know what, but she had seemed preoccupied, distracted during supervisions. At one point she had asked him, half in jest, whether he believed in curses. He'd laughed, and she hadn't. We stood together in the library after he left, the tall windows admitting a flat light that made the dust visible in slow spirals. Lewis leafed through a pile of returned books. I thought of Sir Julian's warning about unearthing things, of Clara's eyes fixed elsewhere, of Fenton's pause, of Dalrymple's unease. It was not yet a pattern, but the edges of one had begun to emerge. Something fragile and old, pulled too far into the present. Outside, the college bell marked the hour, the sound flattening against the stone. The quad was empty. Somewhere behind us, in the shadowed aisles of the library, a book closed with a sound that seemed, for a moment, louder than it should have been. Ellison's rooms at St. Athanasius were neat in a way that didn't quite suggest tidiness so much as the absence of distraction. A single vase on the windowsill, its water stale. A desk arranged with the unyielding symmetry of someone who likes their thoughts to move in straight lines. Lewis had been going through the shelves when he called me over, holding out a manuscript in its archival box with the reverence one gives something both precious and possibly cursed. It was a 15th century vellum text, the sort of thing you could spend a year with and still not be certain you'd understood. In the right-hand margin of one folio, faint beneath the abrasion of some long-forgotten eraser, was a few lines of Latin, the ink thinned almost to transparency. I leaned over it, tracing the words with my eyes rather than my finger. They were not part of the main text, a marginal verse, written in a smaller, less formal hand. A few gaps where the erasure had bitten too deep, but enough remained to reconstruct it. A warning, draped in the usual medieval pieties of a friend whose kiss is a blade, of the shadow cast by a light once trusted. Betrayal. The word hung in my mind with the same faint chill as frost on a window pane. Among the stacks of papers on her desk was a folded broadsheet crossword, the sort sold on the high by a newsagent who knows exactly which customers will grumble if it's a day late. The clue, eclipsed truth, had been circled in neat blue ink, though no answer had been written in. I stared at it a moment, as though sheer will might coax the solution from hiding. No such luck. It remained stubbornly blank, its small absence more eloquent than any entry could have been. Later, in Clara Mowbray's overheated rooms, I asked her about Ellison's recent work. She spoke quickly, a stream of names, dates, and obscure textual disputes. Somewhere in the middle of it, she reached for the reassuring weight of literature, quoting Donne, though not quite. She said, "No man is an island entire unto itself," as though the poet had needed the pronoun to make himself clear. I smiled, or perhaps smirked. She didn't notice. It is a small thing, a misquotation, but I have learned to notice who makes it. Only last year, another scholar had done the same in an unrelated matter. The pronoun slipped in without thought. People who know the text well rarely change it. People who know it half well sometimes can't resist polishing the mirror. When I left, the sky above the college was draining of color, the stones turning the color of ash. Lewis was waiting in the quad, his coat collar turned up against the cold. I told him about the marginal verse, about the crossword clue left in limbo. He asked if they meant anything. "Not yet," I said, "but they will. Things like that always do." We walked out through the gatehouse, the porter's head bent over his ledger. In the street beyond, the wind carried the faint smell of wood smoke. I thought of the erased Latin, of the way words can be scraped away yet still whisper through the fibers of the page, and I thought of Donne, of misquotations, and of a truth waiting somewhere just out of reach. Like the answer to a clue you've seen 100 times but can't quite name, knowing only that it will arrive when it's too late to matter. It was in the King's Arms, of all places, a pub that smells of varnish, old books, and the slow evaporation of beer, that the remark found me. Lewis had gone to fetch the drinks, and I was standing near the bar, listening without listening, when two men at the far end of the counter began speaking just loud enough for the fog of their words to reach me. One said, with a conspirator's relish, that the lady scholar at Saintata, Athanasius, had been seen more than once in close conversation with a certain visiting professor. The other laughed, said something about older flames burning slower but longer. It wasn't much, but gossip rarely needs a foundation. It prefers the scaffolding of suggestion. Fenton received me in his college rooms with the easy composure of a man who has decided to meet an accusation halfway. He didn't bother with denials. Yes, there had been intimacy, he said, years ago now, when she had been visiting his department for a series of lectures. It had ended amicably, without rancor, and they had remained, he used the word, civil. There was no warmth in it. He spoke of her as one might of an artist whose work you once admired, but no longer follow. Lewis, who has a fondness for tangible things, later turned up with a bundle of letters from Ellison's desk. They were folded in a careful, almost ceremonial way, as though the act of folding had been more important than the words themselves. The handwriting was small, deliberate, each line marching neatly across the page. I read them slowly, half because of the script and half because of the tone. Ardent enough, certainly, but in a way that seemed composed. The phrases were the sort that feel second-hand even in the mouth. My heart is in your keeping, your eyes are my safe harbor, the days apart have been winters. It was poetry, but not quite alive. Like reading someone's idea of what love letters should sound like, rather than the thing itself. One passage caught me, a line about a meeting under the plane trees, the branches whispering above. It was too familiar. Somewhere in my reading, I'd come across the same image, not in Ellison's academic work, but in a 15th century lyric, anonymous, the sort of poem that drifts between languages like pollen. The resemblance was too close for coincidence. I asked Lewis if he'd checked the dates. He had. They matched the period Fenton claimed for the affair, though the earliest letters were unsigned and the later ones abruptly less frequent. He seemed to take this as corroboration. I did not. There is a difference between truth and a story that sits comfortably in the mind. Fenton's version was comfortable. Two civilized people recognizing the end of something and stepping aside without bitterness. It was also, I thought, a little too tidy, the edges sanded smooth. And the letters, well, they might have been sincere, but they had the wrong scent. Not of passion, but of construction. That evening I walked back past the Bodleian, its windows glowing against the dark. I thought of the erased verse in Ellison's manuscript, of the crossword clue still waiting on my desk, of Fenton's careful phrasing. Betrayal wears many disguises, and one of them is polite distance. Another is borrowed eloquence. The wind was sharp, the kind that makes you keep your hands deep in your pockets. Somewhere in the high, a busker was playing a thin, reedy tune on a clarinet, the notes carrying strangely far. I found myself wishing I could place the source of those borrowed phrases, not out of pedantry, but because I've learned that people rarely steal words without stealing something else as well. The bursar of Saint Athanasius had the look of a man born to be custodian of other people's affairs. Neat cuffs, a precise parting in the hair, and a voice that made even the simplest statement sound as if it had been extracted from the minutes of a meeting. We sat in his small office off the cloister, the radiator ticking faintly in the corner. He informed me, with a kind of genteel reluctance, that Dr. Ellison had recently updated her will. Her estate, modest by most standards, was to be left not to the college, nor to any academic colleague, but to a niece whose name, Margaret Fenton, meant nothing to me then. The bursar slid across a copy of the will, his fingers lingering just long enough for me to know he did not quite approve of my seeing it. There was no mention of the college in the main bequest, though a small sum had been earmarked for the library's continued care of certain rare volumes. It was this phrase, I suspected, that had fueled the gossip. Oxford thrives on whispers, and I had already heard it murmured that Ellison and Crewe had clashed over the fate of some rare books, whether they were to be retained within St. Athanasius or released under careful supervision to a wider scholarly audience. For some, the thought of a book leaving its cloister is only marginally less shocking than the thought of a body leaving its grave. Crewe himself, when I later raised the subject, allowed a thin smile. "Disputes over property," he said, "can take on a theological intensity here. But I assure you, Inspector, I have no wish to inherit a quarrel from the 15th century. His tone was measured, but there was something in the angle of his head, the slight tightening at the corner of his mouth, that suggested the matter had been far from abstract. It would have been a neat solution. A quarrel over valuable books, an updated will, a sudden death. Greed is a blunt instrument, but it has a way of producing clean motives. Lewis seemed half convinced. I asked him to make a few discreet inquiries about the niece. He returned 2 days later with the facts. She was a school teacher in a small coastal town, living in a narrow terraced house with a ginger cat and a garden given over to roses. No debts worth mentioning, no sudden change in circumstances, no history of visiting Oxford. She had attended her aunt's funeral, he added, and had looked appropriately bewildered by the formalities. No connection, then, to the quarrels over books or the layered grievances of a college that had made privacy into a profession. That evening I walked through Christchurch Meadow, the grass silvered by frost. My thoughts returned to the bursar's office, to the will, to the careful way his fingers had released the paper. The will had the shape of significance, but not the weight of it. A bequest to a relative barely known to the city's whispering circles. A quarrel that might have ended in a slammed door, but hardly in death. I stopped under one of the great elms, the branches black against a darkening sky. Somewhere in my pocket was a scrap of paper with the crossword clue still unsolved. Eclipsed truth. I turned the phrase over again in my mind, thinking of wills, of bequests, of books locked away, of words scraped from vellum yet still visible in the fibers. A truth can be eclipsed, yes, by greed, by love, by the slow passage of years, but it is never wholly extinguished. As I turned back towards the high, The bells began to toll the hour. Their sound folded into the cold air, absorbed by the stone. In Oxford, secrets don't vanish. They are inherited, like books, like debts, like grudges in a place where history is less a subject than a climate. And the climate at St. Athanasius, I suspected, was still unsettled. It took longer than expected to persuade the night porter, though in truth persuasion in Oxford rarely involves more than the right tone and the implication that you already have permission. The lodge smelled of coal dust and last week's rain, and the porter regarded me with the wary respect one reserves for a man likely to make more work for you. Eventually, keys in hand, he led me across the quad, the frost crisp underfoot, the library of St. Athanasius, after hours, had a different gravity. The day's careful hum was gone, the air felt thick, as if it had been sitting in the dark for centuries. The porter unlocked the heavy door with a twist and a sigh, and then left me to it, the sound of his steps retreating down the cloister. My eyes adjusted slowly. A few reading lamps stood sentinel over long oak tables, their brass shades dark except for one near the back. It was switched off, yet when I rested my fingers lightly on the shade, it was still faintly warm. A small, domestic heat that suggested recent company. Given the time and the library's rules, it was a detail that refused to fit neatly into place. Ellison's usual desk was not hard to identify. A neat arrangement of reference cards, each clipped in the same upper left corner, a magnifying glass with a worn handle, a bottle of black ink half full and slightly clotted at the neck. Beside it, the shelves bore the dense company of medieval scholarship. Editions of Chaucer's lesser works, critical studies on Arthurian romances, paleography manuals with cracked spines. One space gaped empty. The surrounding dust had a way of making absence look deliberate. I leaned closer to read the shelf label, Medieval Ciphers. I scanned the nearby volumes. The ones on either side slouched slightly into the vacancy, as though leaning towards each other in gossip. The borrowing ledger was kept, with stubborn tradition, in a leather-bound book at the desk nearest the entrance. I paged through the recent entries until I found it. The cipher book signed out under the name Peter Dalrymple, dated 2 nights ago. The signature was shaky, the pen strokes uneven, as though made by a hand either in haste or unfamiliar with itself. I thought of Dalrymple's careful neatness when he had signed his supervision schedule the week before. This was not the same hand. I stood a while longer, letting the quiet have its way with me. The high windows admitted only a suggestion of moonlight, the glass fogged with the breath of winter. Somewhere deeper in the stacks, the wood creaked, the sort of sound that could be the building settling or something smaller moving just out of sight. On my way out, I paused again at the warm lamp. The metal was cooling now, but still bore that faint human trace. A ghost of recent touch, proof that the library had been less empty than it wished to appear. The porter took the keys back without comment, though his eyes flicked once to my face, as if measuring whether I had found what I was looking for. Back in the cold of the quad, the frost glittered faintly under the lamplight. I thought of the missing book, of the shaky signature, of the warmth of brass hours after it should have gone cold. In a place like St. Athanasius, heat lingers even when the source has gone. And perhaps, either the Randolphs' dining room was quiet that day, the lunch crowd dispersed to their various cloisters. Morse sat with his back to the window, sunlight falling in pale, fractured strips across the tablecloth. He prodded his omelette, as if hoping to unearth the answer inside. Lewis, across from him, was still chewing through steak and kidney pie in a manner that suggested both contentment and urgency. "You're not eating," Lewis observed finally. "I'm thinking," said Morse, with the tone of a man for whom eating and thinking were mutually exclusive pursuits. Lewis glanced at the folded notepad beside Morse's plate. "You've been scribbling the same line for 10 minutes. "Not the same line," Morse corrected. "The same error." He tapped his pen against the paper. There it was again, the oddity that had been nagging since Clara Mowbray had misquoted Donne in his office. No man is an island, entire unto himself. Wrong. And then Hugh Fenton, days earlier, had made precisely the same slip while pretending not to know Ellison's work very well. Lewis frowned. So they both got the same quote wrong. People misquote things all the time. Yes, said Morse, but academics in English literature? Twice. The same way. That's not careless, that's habitual. Which means they've read it somewhere, repeatedly in the wrong form. Lewis wiped his mouth. Like a book, or an article, or a doctoral thesis. Something printed and wrong. Morse leaned back, the memory pressing harder now. A winter afternoon in his flat, the radio playing softly, and himself leafing through a journal, the Literary Quarterly, more for distraction than duty. A review that bristled with pedantry, picking apart a recent monograph on metaphysical poets. One of the charges had been the persistent misquotation of Donne, in precisely this mangled form. The reviewer had hinted at plagiarism, but stopped short of naming the culprit. Lewis, said Morse suddenly, we need the Bodleian. And the last 2 years' worth of Literary Quarterly, Lewis groaned. Another afternoon with dusty shelves and no tea. But the Bodleian did yield treasure. An hour later, Morse had the review in front of him, the prose as dry and acerbic as he remembered. The unnamed author of the flawed monograph had also lifted entire passages from another scholar's unpublished lecture notes, a fact known apparently only to a small inner circle. He tapped the page. Ellison would have been in that circle. Lewis read over his shoulder. So if she found out, she could have exposed them. Morse smiled thinly, and perhaps intended to. But something still jarred. 2 culprits sharing the same sin, that's rare in plagiarism cases. 1 thief, maybe. 2? Unless... He stopped, staring past Lewis toward the tall windows and the drifting dust. Unless they weren't thieves separately. Unless they were partners. Back in his flat that evening, Morse poured a small scotch and took out Ellison's crossword, the circled clue, eclipsed truth, staring up at him. He tried a few tentative entries, none quite fitting. The poem in the manuscript margins came to mind. Veiled betrayal, half erased. The clock chimed 8. Somewhere down the street, a radio played a slow movement from Elgar, and Morse sat very still, the drink forgotten. Clara and Fenton, the elegant plagiarists, Ellison, the discoverer, and between them some shared project, perhaps decades old, that bound them in both ambition and fear. But why kill now? That was the question Morse carried with him to bed, unanswered, turning in his mind like the second hand of the clock. So Drain tapped faintly at Morse's office window when Lewis came in, balancing 2 mugs of tea and a folder thick with photocopies. Morse ignored the tea, reaching instead for the brown envelope on his desk. Found this at the bottom of Ellison's box files, he said, sliding the envelope open. Out came an old black and white photograph, its corners frayed, the gloss dulled with age. A dozen young faces peered out, all in cap and gown, the Oxford stone behind them sunlit and honey gold. Morse pointed to 3 figures near the center. Clara Mowbray, Hugh Fenton, and Ellison herself, looking younger and more amused than I've ever seen her. Lewis peered closer. And Sir Julian. Not in this frame, Morse said, but look at the inscription on the back. Lewis turned it over. In neat blue fountain pen ink, Magdalen College, 1982. Lewis shrugged. So? Morse tapped the edge of the photograph. The trouble, Lewis, is that the style of the gowns changed in 81? Small thing, but visible. And that building in the background. That scaffolding was up in 84. I remember it because I tripped over a pile of boards outside the porter's lodge. Lewis gave a low whistle. So the date's wrong. Quite, Morse said, smiling faintly. And that raises a question. Why would someone misdate a harmless old photo? While Lewis went off to cross-check college records, Morse pulled the underlined register entry from his file, the one he'd found in the library ledger. It had bothered him for days, Dalrymple's name, written in a slightly trembling hand, underlined once in pencil. He had assumed it was Ellison's own mark, perhaps indicating a source she meant to chase. Now, he laid the photo alongside the ledger page. The underlining, he realized, wasn't arbitrary. The date beside it, 12th March, was a perfect match for the real date of the photograph. Lewis returned 10 minutes later with a sheaf of photocopied admissions lists. You're right. That photo was taken in 1984, not 82. All three of them were in Oxford that term, and Fenton's supposed to have been lecturing in Edinburgh. Morse sat back, steepling his fingers. Except he wasn't. He picked up the ledger again. The register didn't lie. Fenton had signed in at the library on the 11th of March, the day before Ellison died. That was 2 days earlier than he'd told them, and someone, perhaps Ellison herself, had underlined Dalrymple's name to mark the day. She knew, Morse said quietly. She knew Fenton had been here. And she meant to confront him, Lewis frowned. But why all the secrecy? Why not just tell someone? Because, Lewis, she was an academic, Morse said with a note of weary amusement. And academics love nothing more than an elegant trap. I think she meant to catch him out. And in doing so, she caught his attention. He poured himself the now lukewarm tea. We need to know what else she had that tied him to that day. My guess is, it's not just the date. Lewis glanced again at the photograph. Maybe she thought the picture would prove something. Or perhaps, Morse said, it was simply a reminder that the past, like a badly dated photograph, can be made to tell a different story, provided no one looks too closely. Outside, the rain had turned to a steady patter. Morse, gazing at the black and white faces frozen in their academic finery, thought again of Ellison's marginal poem about betrayal. The neat inked date on the back of the photograph now felt less like a caption and more like a warning, one that had gone unread until it was far too late. S. Guilt. The afternoon light slanted across the quad as Morse found Fenton in his book-lined office, the air thick with pipe smoke and a faint hint of whiskey. The man looked up from his desk with the carefully measured calm of someone trying to seem untroubled. "Inspector," he said, a faint smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. "Another round of questions?" "Not questions," Morse replied, taking the chair without invitation. "Just the truth." At last, Fenton's eyebrow rose, an academic's way of showing irritation. Morse laid a small folder on the desk. "You and Clara weren't rivals, not really. You were partners, in scholarship and in theft." The smile faltered. "That's a rather ugly word." "So is plagiarism," Morse said evenly. "The same mistranslation in both your articles. A slip no independent translator would have made. But it wasn't a slip, was it? You both took from the same source. An obscure continental scholar, barely known outside a few dusty libraries in Liège." Ellison recognized the error, and she kept quiet at first. Then she decided to act. Fenton shook his head, his eyes narrowing. "You can't prove—" "I can." Morse's voice was quiet but unyielding. "The photograph in her papers. You, Clara, and Ellison. The date on the back was wrong, deliberately wrong. It marked the day you visited Oxford, the day before she died. Not 3 days after, as you told us. She underlined your name in the guest register to make sure the truth wouldn't be missed. That was her proof. Not for the police, but for the college, for posterity." Fenton's hand twitched toward his glass. He didn't drink. Morse continued, The so-called Latin verse we found, it wasn't poetry at all. It was a cipher, a note to herself. Roughly translated, 2 voices, 1 theft. She'd worked out the connection between you and Clara. For a moment, the office was silent but for the faint ticking of a clock. You went to her rooms, Morse said, to persuade her not to go public. She refused. You panicked. The sedative in her glass was meant to keep her quiet long enough for you to take the papers. But you didn't know her heart condition. Or perhaps you didn't care. Either way, you miscalculated. She never woke up. Fenton's gaze dropped to the desktop, to the neat row of sharpened pencils. I didn't mean... His voice cracked, and he stopped himself. She was going to destroy me. Everything I've built. Everything you built, Morse cut in, wasn't yours to begin with. The silence stretched again, longer this time. Outside, the muffled voices of students drifted up from the quad, laughter, footsteps on stone. Finally, Fenton exhaled, a long, slow breath, and reached for the whiskey after all. His hands shook just enough to spill a drop on the blotter. You'll want a statement, he said flatly. I'll want the truth, Morse replied. He stood, feeling the weight of the moment, not triumph, but the dull inevitability of justice. At the door, Fenton spoke again, his voice low. She was better than both of us. That's why it had to be her in the end. Morse paused, then walked away without answering. The arrest was arranged with the kind of discretion Oxford excels at. A matter of whispered arrangements, side doors, and a police car idling in Radcliffe Square with its lights off. Lewis and 2 uniformed officers waited in the dim stairwell outside Fenton's set of rooms in St. Mark's. Inside, the room smelled faintly of brandy and stale pipe smoke. Fenton, still in his gown from an earlier lecture, did not protest. He simply set down the glass in his hand and looked at Morse with a sort of weary contempt. So it's to be the police then, he said. It usually is, Morse replied, though without triumph. He gestured towards the door. Best we keep this quiet, eh? No need for theatrics. Fenton did not resist as Lewis led him out. There were no photographers, no shouting. Only the sound of the college porter's keys jangling in the archway as they disappeared into the night. By morning, rumors had begun their slow seep through the senior common rooms. Something about irregularities. An incident. Nothing concrete. The dons, in the way of dons, preferred uncertainty. It kept things neater. Clara tendered her resignation the following week. The official line was, health reasons. Morse saw her once more, briefly, in the quad. She looked thinner, her hands worrying the strap of her handbag. There was no trace of defiance now, only a kind of numb resignation. She passed him without speaking. Lewis, never comfortable with silences, broke it later over a pint in the King's Arms. I suppose you knew from the start, sir. Fenton, I mean. You always seemed so sure. Morse shook his head. Not sure. Never that. Just suspicious. There was a name underlined in pencil in Ellison's notebook, and a crossword clue she'd half scribbled beside it. What clue was that? Eclipsed truth. 7 letters. He sipped his pint, eyes half on the curling wallpaper behind Lewis. I couldn't get it for days. Only came to me this morning. Occultation. Lewis frowned. Astronomy term, isn't it? Yes. When one thing hides another from view, Morse set his glass down with a quiet thud. Quite fitting, don't you think? They sat for a while without speaking. Outside, the autumn light was already fading from the narrow streets, leaving the city to its lamps and its long shadows. Somewhere, a college choir was rehearsing for evensong, the voices drifting in faint, fractured harmonies through the damp air. Morse finished his pint and stood. Come on, Lewis. We've done our bit. Let's leave the rest to the paperwork. As they stepped out into the chill, The bells of St. Mary's began to toll the hour. The sound followed them down the cobbled lane until it was swallowed by the quiet. The mist lay heavy over Oxford, a soft pall that dulled the sharp edges of stone and spire. It pressed close to the river, curling about, the low branches of willows and dissolving the lamps along the towpath into faint yellow blurs. Morse's shoes crunched on the gravel as he walked, hands deep in his coat pockets, the collar turned up against the damp. He had not meant to come here. The day's business had been concluded, his report delivered, the paperwork left to Lewis. But his feet had followed some quiet instinct, bringing him down to the Isis, where the world seemed stripped of color and sound. Only the slow, patient swirls of water moved beneath the shroud. From across the meadow, the bells began. Magdalen first, then Merton, then the distant and mournful echo of Christ Church. The fog caught the sound and held it, softening it until it seemed to come from nowhere at all. He stopped near a bench, the same one, he realized, where he had sat weeks before, chasing a crossword clue that had refused to yield. The newspaper was still in his coat pocket. He drew it out and smoothed it on his knee, the paper limp with damp. All the boxes were filled now. Ellison's face came to him, the half-smile, the cool, exact way she had spoken of her work. He thought of her determination to keep the academy honest, even when honesty brought no reward and little comfort. He thought, too, of other women he had known. Clever, resolute, unwilling to be persuaded into easier compromises, and always, just beyond reach. A faint wind rose from the water, making the reeds whisper. It caught the edge of the paper, threatening to lift it from his hands. He let it go. The crossword slid from his knee and came to rest on the bench. He turned away, the gravel crunching again underfoot. Behind him, the pages stirred once more, shifting open so that one word was momentarily visible in the pale light. Occultation. The final clue answered. Before long, the fog swallowed bench, paper, river, and him.